This video was made with support from my patrons, whose names are on screen now. If you want to, you can join them today and even get access to exclusive content. The link to my Patreon is in the description, so check it out if you're interested. Anyway, on with the show. Have you ever been hyped for a new game release? My guess is you most likely have. It's only natural to get excited about something that you're looking forward to. But when you do eventually get your hands on it, it's very easy to forget about that awkward period in between when the game was announced and when it actually released. As a longtime fan of Gran Turismo, this is something that I know very well. Over its past 27 years, Gran Turismo has become infamous for its delays. Times when the releases of its games had to be pushed back for various reasons. So, what I thought would be interesting to do in this video is to catalogue every single time a mainline Gran Turismo game has been held back from releasing. We'll be covering not just the delays themselves, but why they were delayed, how this was communicated, and what the repercussions really were. And at the end, we'll tally up all of the delays across each of the games to reach a final total figure for just how long fans of this series have been held back from getting their fix. From a player's point of view, a delay is never a good thing, but sometimes it really is the best option. A delayed game is eventually good, but a rushed game is forever bad. It is a quote often misattributed to Shigeru Miyamoto. But regardless of who said it first, there's still a lot of truth in it. What I want to know is, was this true for Gran Turismo, or were Polyphony just wasting our time? Let's find out. What's really fascinating about the culture of delays that has pervaded this series is that it can all be traced back to one specific point. The original Gran Turismo first released in Japan on the 23rd of December 1997. It's quite well known that the game had been in development for some 5 years beforehand, but as far as I can tell, it was never officially delayed. Being a brand new IP, I suppose there would have been no real reason to set a strict deadline, especially when there were no guarantees that would even have much of an audience. It seems like it was an it'll be out when it's out kind of situation. And we know what happened after that. The game was an instant hit, selling more than 2 million copies over the next 6 months in Japan alone. Of course, this massive success resulted in the game being made available worldwide in May of 1998. Once again, there were no reports of this release being pushed back either, and considering that not a huge amount was changed between releases, there wasn't any reason to. But where this gets interesting is with what happens next. At this time, what was a studio within Sony called Polys Entertainment became a fully fledged developer in its own right, now named Polyphony Digital. With this, a sequel to Gran Turismo seemed inevitable, and so it was officially announced in February of 1999 that Gran Turismo 2 would be releasing later that year. But when exactly? Initially, no concrete release date was given, however it was reported that the game was scheduled for sometime in the summer. But it would take until July before we would see the first official date given by Sony, September 30th for the Japanese release. Fast forward to early September, and Sony would also clarify GT2's international release as December 7th, with the Japanese version still on track for its original date. However, a couple of weeks later, during the Tokyo Game Show, it was clarified that the Japanese release would be pushed back to sometime in November. Skipping forward now to early November, sources at Sony cast doubt on the December 7th international release, although they stated that they still had every intention of shipping the game within the calendar year. By December 1st, GT2 still hadn't released in Japan, and it was reported that retailers in North America were not expecting to be able to sell copies of GT2 until January 20th at the earliest. However, representatives from Sony still insisted on the December 7th date. That date came and went, and still no GT2. But the game did release in Japan on December 11th. And a few days later, on the 16th, the game would finally hit store shelves in North America as well. But that still left the PAL region, who would have to wait until January 28th to finally get their hands on GT2. I found a scan of the December 1999 issue of Edge magazine which confirms this delay, but interestingly, it also mentions a delay to January 14th in Japan, which turned out to be false. Having multiple regional versions of these games does muddy the waters, but for the sake of clarity, I'll use the original Japanese release to gauge GT2. The game was announced for release on September 30th, was delayed once to sometime in November, delayed again to December 7th, the international release date, and delayed a third and final time to December 11th when it finally released. That's 3 delays spanning a total delay period of 2 months and 11 days. And yet, some would argue that GT2 was not delayed enough. The original release of this game was compromised in many ways. Not only did content have to be scrapped to make the deadline, such as cars, tracks, and the elusive drag racing game mode, but it was also littered with bugs. From the original North American version, there were cars merging into each other, cars being deleted from your garage after using the machine test, opponent cars appearing in events they shouldn't do, and of course, not being able to achieve 100% completion. It was so bad that Sony had to offer replacement discs with a patched version of the game to those affected. Of course, a major reason why the game wasn't delayed further was due to Sony wanting GT2 to release in time for the Christmas period. Sony themselves even stated as much. But ultimately, Polyphony Digital and its founder, Kazunori Yamauchi, knew that GT2 could have been much more polished had they been granted the time. As perfectionists, that would have hurt. And this is the key moment I was talking about that really defines all of the delays that were to come for their future games. This is a mistake that they would not allow to happen again. So, on to the next title, Gran Turismo 3. The development of GT3 was an interesting story. Originally previewed all the way back in September 1999, before GT2 had even come out, it was known as Gran Turismo 2000, and was slated as a launch title for the upcoming PlayStation 2. The game would continue to be previewed in an updated form throughout 2000, but it was announced in August that the game would not be launching with the PS2 in North America. PlayStation Australia, on the other hand, confirmed that it would still be in that country, with November 30th the given date. So what was going on? Well, everything was clarified at the Sony Gamers Day event at the end of September. It was announced that the game would not be releasing that year, but instead the first quarter of 2001. The other big piece of news was that the game would now be known as Gran Turismo 3. A wise decision. GT 2001 just doesn't have a good ring to it. But in mid-December, we would finally receive a concrete date from Sony themselves. February 15th in Japan, with the international versions to follow roughly a couple of months afterwards. Then, in early January, as things were really ramping up for the game's release, Sony broke the news that it was being pushed back to April in Japan. The explanation given was a desire to add the latest cars into the game and to improve on the overall quality of the title. In that sense, it seems quite fitting that just a few days later, it was announced that the all-new Mazda RX-8 would be appearing in GT3. In February, a rough date was given for GT3's North American release, June. But, true to their word, finally, Gran Turismo 3 would release in Japan on the 28th of April, and the game would release worldwide not long after, at least not without one more delay to July 10th in North America and July 20th in PAL regions. So, to summarise with the Japanese version, the game was planned for a late 2000 release, roughly the end of November as per some prior speculation. It was then delayed once to February 15th, and then a second time to April 28th. That's 2 delays and a total delay period of 5 months. So once again, was this worth it? Well, as the resident GT3 simp, I'd say yes, absolutely. I've mentioned before about how this game changed so much during its development that arguably it would have been a different game entirely had it released in its GT 2000 guise. Of course, in retrospect, a game that is like GT3 but with even fewer cars, tracks, and less graphical fidelity doesn't seem all that appealing in current day. not to mention any potential bugs there may have been if they rushed it like GT2. Well, more than what were in the game anyway. I have no doubt that GT2000 as it were would have been a very successful game regardless. Reading the reports from back in the day, you can really understand the level of anticipation there was for this game. I almost feel like Polyphony could have released anything and it would have been a hit. But ultimately, giving themselves more time to polish the game and make it a complete experience has really cemented the legacy of GT3 beyond purely its sales figures. I got the feeling that whilst people weren't happy that it was being delayed, they did understand and appreciated it given what happened with GT2. For all its flaws, that game was still very well received, both critically and commercially, but GT3 was on another level. This, more than anything, seemed to validate Polyphony's decision. They could have rushed out GT2000 for the 2000 holiday season, just like GT2 the year before, but instead they took their time and made something that, from their perspective, they were much more satisfied with. This was yet another experience that Polyphony would take with them as they moved on to their future projects. Word on the fourth installment in the GT franchise first broke in March of 2003. Kazunori Yamauchi made a short statement in which he talked about pursuing deeper simulation aspects in their next title, as well as the possibility of online play and modelled car damage. But the first time that anything from Gran Turismo 4 would be seen publicly was in early May. The reveal was planned for E3 in mid-May, however UK's Evo magazine published their June issue a week early, and so inadvertently leaked their deep dive into GT4. We got our first glimpse of the game through the many screenshots included, but also some key details courtesy of Kazunori himself. The game was planned to have more than 1,000 car models, and most importantly for this video, was scheduled for Christmas 2003. But when the game was officially revealed on May 13th, this was changed to sometime in 2004, and also the more reasonable figure of over 500 cars. Even still, rumours of GT4 releasing in 2003 still persisted. This would come to a head at the Tokyo Motor Show in October, where Polyphony announced Gran Turismo 4 Prologue. The idea of GT4 Prologue was to be an introduction to Gran Turismo for newer players, but also as a stopgap to give fans of the series a sneak peek of the full GT4. The game was only announced for Japan, coming on December 4th, with the full game being given a tentative release window of summer 2004 in the country. GT4 Prologue would release as planned, and it would later be sold in South Korea, starting in January 2004, and Europe in May, where it also included a bonus Making of Gran Turismo 4 video. But back to the full GT4, the deadline of November was given for the North American version of the game. However, at some point, the summer 2004 estimate for the Japanese version went out of the window, and it was even rumoured that the game could come out in North America before Japan. Many new details emerged from the Tokyo Game Show in September. The game would no longer include an online mode from launch, but it would include B-Spec mode, where the AI would drive on the player's behalf. In terms of release dates, we were now given December 3rd for Japan and December 14th for America and PAL regions. In October, it was revealed that the PAL version would be pushed back to the first quarter of 2005, due to the extra time required to translate the game into multiple languages. But Japan and North America didn't get off scot-free either. It was announced in succession in the middle of November that the game was being pushed back to December 28th in Japan and Q1 2005 in North America. This, thankfully, would be the final set of delays. Gran Turismo 4 would launch as planned on the 28th of December in Japan. In early February, both the North American and PAL versions would get concrete dates, February 22nd and March 9th respectively, and they too would launch without issue. Let's have a recap then. The game was first slated for Christmas 2003, but this was soon amended to sometime in 2004 and later summer 2004. But summer 2004 came and went, and the game still didn't release in Japan. It was then given the date of December 3rd, and then it was pushed back a third and final time to December 28th. That's 3 delays spanning a total delay period of almost exactly 1 year. We can now establish the trend of delays getting longer with each subsequent game. Remember, it was just over 2 months for GT2 and 5 months for GT3. Of course, GT4's development still wasn't without its sacrifices. Online play was scrapped entirely. There were plans for a separate GT4 Online edition to release afterwards, but beyond a couple of closed test versions, this never came to fruition. But the extra time did afford them to widen the scope of the game. The rough estimate of 500 cars ended up looking quite conservative compared to the actual 700 plus figure that we would see. Once again, there's no doubt that delaying the game was the right thing to do in hindsight. The legendary reputation that GT4 has in current day really is proof of that. Like GT2000's transition into GT3, we also got a preview of what the game may have turned out like if it weren't delayed so many times. GT4 Prologue was created on a modified version of the game engine from GT3, whereas the full game was entirely bespoke in that respect. It did make the game feel unique, rather than simply just an iteration of the previous title, like GT2 was for the original game. As with GT3, they were forced to skip the very lucrative holiday season to make sure that the game was in a complete state before being shipped. Not only did they miss the original Christmas 2003 proposal, but also Christmas 2004, with the Japanese version just scraping in by the end of the year and the international releases coming a couple of months later. Clearly, it wasn't an ideal situation. Sure, you want your game to be as good as it can be, but it's called a deadline for a reason. The inner struggle between Sony wanting the game to release and Polyphony wanting the game to be perfect was evident to see. But little did we know just how much this would come to influence the franchise in the years ahead. E3 in June 2005 is where the road to the next Gran Turismo would officially begin. Unveiled as Vision Gran Turismo, this short trailer offered a glimpse of what would be possible on the next generation hardware. Ultimately, what was shown was just pre-rendered footage of GT4 with more cars on track. The PlayStation 3 wouldn't even come onto the market until the end of 2006 anyway. So now we skip forward to E3 the following year. It's here that Gran Turismo HD would be announced. The idea for this game was twofold. First, there was GT HD Classic, which would have been like an enhanced version of GT4, including the Bikes and Tourist trophy and featuring online play. Secondly, there was GT HD Premium. This mode would have acted as a preview for the next full Gran Turismo title, featuring 30 cars and 2 tracks that were all designed from scratch for the PlayStation 3. That next full Gran Turismo game would of course be Gran Turismo 5, which was only mentioned for the first time in September. At this point, it was planned for a release sometime in 2008, with GT HD to come in advance of that. As it turned out, by the end of 2006, the GT HD project would be dropped. Even still, Polyphony would end up releasing GT HD Concept before the year was out, but this was a far more scaled back version featuring just 1 track and a handful of cars. It was decided that their development efforts would instead be focused on the full GT5. After this, we would have to wait until E3 in June 2007 for more news. Here, we would receive the first official trailer for GT5, as well as the announcement of GT5 Prologue. Much like with GT4, it was decided to create a shorter demo version to preview the full game, and also to give players something to tide them over, whilst they waited for GT5 in full. GT5 Prologue would initially launch in December 2007 in Japan, but not without having a delay of its own, as it was planned for an October release to begin with. This game would later be released internationally throughout 2008, where it would be continually updated all the way into 2009. But of course, work on the full GT5 would still continue in the background. In March 2008, it was confirmed by Chris Inohosa Miranda, a Sony producer at the time, that GT5 was still about a year away, so a 2008 release seemed very unlikely. The months after that saw much speculation around GT5's release date. Kazunori had implied that it could even be pushed back to 2010 as the scope of the game increased, as well as the active development of Gran Turismo on the PSP at the same time. There were also rumours that it could be ready for Christmas 2009. But yet again, it would be at E3 in June where more would be revealed. A new trailer was dropped, highlighting NASCAR and the WRC, as well as the game's long-awaited damage model. But even more interesting were the comments from Kazunori, where he stated that they could release GT5 anytime they wanted to. Of course, this didn't confirm anything, but a 2009 release didn't seem so unlikely. At Gamescom in September, brochures were given out to attendees seeming to confirm a release date in Q4 2009. This was the most clear indication we had of when the game might be coming out, and it lined up with the rough estimates that many sources were implying from internally within Sony. However, it's still important to note that this was not an official release date, as made clear by the fact that it never appeared anywhere in Sony's marketing of the game. Even still, a lot of people at the time had their hopes pinned on a late 2009 release. So it came as a disappointment to many when Kaz appeared at the Tokyo Game Show in September, stating that they were aiming to launch the game in Japan in March 2010. This was followed up in December, once again by Chris Inahosa, who implied that the US release of the game was planned for summer 2010, following after the launch in Japan. In January, the official box art was shown off, featuring the Mercedes SLS as the cover car. It looked like GT5 was finally just around the corner. But later in the month, there would be yet another setback for GT5. Polyphony would announce that the game was being postponed from its planned March release date. It was reported by Reuters that this was due to production-related matters. Later in April, Kaz stated that the game could have been launched in March as planned, but was pushed back as, and I quote, "the finished product wouldn't have had everything that I wanted to include." Not long after this, he then commented that GT5 was about 90% finished. In the meantime, there had been mentions from a handful of sources that the game was now looking at a fall 2010 release, but once again it would be left to Sony's presence at E3 in June to deliver the concrete facts. Along with yet another trailer, we were given the date November 2nd. This date was for the North American release, and just a week later, it appeared as though we had one in Europe as well, November 24th. This came courtesy of a listing on Sony France's website, but at Gamescom in August, this was confirmed to actually be November 3rd. After this, Sony's promotion of the game ramped up considerably. Gran Turismo 5 was finally coming. But there would be one more twist in the story. It was announced on October 13th that GT5 would not be making its planned early November release. All that could be said for its new date was that it would be coming this holiday season. The game had reportedly missed its window by just 3 days due to manufacturing issues, and so a new production schedule had to be arranged by Sony. And on November 12th, another date would be set, November 24th for North America and Europe. Ironically, this was the exact date that had been listed by Sony France all the way back in June. And with not even a fortnight to go, there was no chance it could be delayed again. Gran Turismo 5, at long last, was in players' hands on the 24th of November and the 25th in Japan and Australia. Thus ended the most drawn-out pre-release period of any Gran Turismo game ever. To think that in the 4+ years between GT5 being announced and it actually releasing, Forza Motorsport developed and launched 2 complete games and established itself as GT's biggest rival. When trying to do the summary for GT5, it's not quite as simple as the previous games. For example, 2008 was given as a rough initial target, but it was never official, so to say that the game was delayed as far back as then seems a bit harsh. But at the same time, I still feel like it's important to mention this, as GT5 was teased as early as 2005, albeit in a different form. If we're talking about solid dates, the first of these we got was for around Christmas 2009. Again, it's not perfect, since it's not an exact date, and it was mostly just used internally within Sony. Even still, if you were following the progress of GT5 at the time, there was virtually no way that you didn't know about this, so I think it's a good starting point. From there, the game was delayed once to March 2010, a second time to November 2nd, 2010, and a third and final time to November 24th, 2010. That's 3 delays spanning roughly 11 months. It seems strange to think that using this method, GT4 was officially delayed for longer than GT5. Of course, if you want to include that vague 2008 estimate, this could jump to over 2 years. Although that wouldn't be strictly correct, I do feel like it would be more representative of how it felt to follow the franchise during this period. There were times when it truly felt like GT5 would never come out. But of course it did, so now we have to ask the question, were these delays really worth it? Well, in respect to this, I like to think back to Kazunori's comments from E3 2009, where he stated that they could release the game anytime they wanted to. Whilst of course this wasn't literal, even if he made the decision then and there, there's always a lead-in time with things needing to be polished and finalised, I do like to think about what the game may have looked like had he made that decision when he said it. I imagine it looking somewhat like GT5 Prologue, but with the reused content from GT4 carried over. Of course, there would be fewer premium PS3 era cars and tracks, probably a more basic damage model, fewer online features, no course maker, and generally a more simplified single player experience with less gameplay variety. Of course, GT5 as it was had its detractors. With the game being so anticipated, many touting it to be the greatest racing game ever made, there was no way that it was going to live up to everyone's expectations. Still, that doesn't excuse its issues, like its career mode, which was noticeably shorter and more restrictive than its predecessors, or the many technical shortcomings, like with its loading times and general performance. And that's before we even mention the 800 or so standard car models. I'll just say this about GT5. It suffers from being too ambitious in some ways, with how many different things it tries, and yet not ambitious enough in others. A full discussion of this game is something I'll save for another video, but it's clear that the delays didn't solve every issue it had. If GT5 weren't so heavily delayed, it would have been a worse game, no doubt, but at the same time, I also think it would have been less disappointing. When a game is delayed in the desire to make it better, naturally this only adds to the weight of expectation. And the expectations on GT5 were already immense. So to see it end up as anything other than perfect was unacceptable for many. I think that understanding the development struggles behind the PS3 and its cell processor that caused most of the headaches really gives some clarity into what may have gone wrong. In some respects, given the scope they were aiming for with GT5, I don't believe it would have ever met expectations no matter how long they spent making it. Being perfectionists, Kaz and Polyphony are never 100% satisfied with any game they release. But to me, the flaws with GT5 were so much more inherent than any of their other previous games that it must have hurt just that bit more. Even though they had done everything in their power to prevent what had happened with GT2 from happening again, it still wasn't enough. Gran Turismo 6 was announced on the 15th of May 2013. It was given an initial release window of Holiday 2013, and later in August, this was clarified as the 6th of December. If we fast forward to December, Gran Turismo 6 would release as planned. Wait, hold on, let me read that again. If we fast forward to December, Gran Turismo 6 would release as planned. Didn't expect that. Yes, in 2013, GT6 became only the second Gran Turismo game to not be delayed, 16 years after the first, the original Gran Turismo. So, did Polyphony finally get their act together? Well, in reality, there are a few key reasons why this was possible. A simpler one is that GT6 had been in development for many years already before being announced in 2013. You can find interviews with Kaz where he's talking about GT6 before GT5 had even been released. It seems like they only announced the game once they were 100% certain that it could meet the proposed dates, which I suppose is a nice way to make up for the wild goose chase that was GT5. But the other key point was the overall scope of GT6. Despite the PlayStation 4 releasing in November, GT6 was still on the PS3. This was seen as a very strange decision by many, but it made one thing very clear. GT6 was simply an evolution of GT5. So, I guess the question we can ask in this case is, would it have been beneficial for them to delay GT6? I would say no. Of course, releasing on an already outdated console is an important factor, but I also don't think that the game would have benefited all that much from the extra time. GT6 mostly just takes what GT5 did and adds on to it. It was improved in a handful of areas, but it was also lacking in many of the same ways, most notably with the single-player career. This was already an area of contempt for players with GT5, but GT6's manages to be even shorter, for example lacking endurance races entirely. It's also very handholdy and restrictive. Need I mention the forced Honda Fit yet again? Anyway, the point I'm making is that I don't think that giving it more time in the oven would have really made it that much better. What many of us view as its key issues were seemingly by design, rather than any serious limitations. Of course, you could argue that the game should have been delayed and rebuilt for the PS4, but at that point we would be talking about a different game entirely. You could also contend that it should have been delayed to allow them to add more features from launch that we would eventually see in the updates. But I don't think the trade-off would have really been worth it. For example, the course maker was finally added almost 2 years after the game came out, so what would really be the benefit? As I said, focus was already shifting away from the PS3, so really the sooner this game came out, the better. So with that said, let's move on to Gran Turismo's debut on the PlayStation 4. October 27th, 2015 was the day, almost 2 full years after the console had launched. This is when we would find out about Gran Turismo Sport. From the off, it was given the release window of 2016, with a beta test to take place as early as spring. Then Sony executive Jim Ryan made a point of backing the game and its 2016 release, clearly aware of the series' track record. But after that, there was radio silence, and by March, many were already casting doubt on that 2016 declaration. But finally, in May, there would be some news. GT Sport would be having an official unveiling event in London. Here, many details about the game were divulged, including a release date. November 15th, 2016 was the target for the game's initial launch. The only downside was that the public beta had to be scrapped to maintain that target. By early August, Kaz stated that GT Sport was now 70% complete and being improved on a daily basis, in preparation for its November release. But by the end of August, things had changed. The game was officially delayed to 2017, to the surprise of someone, presumably. The reason given was that more time was needed to perfect the game, and there would be new features announced in due course. One upside of this was that there would now be time to host the beta test as planned. There was a closed beta held in March 2017, initially just in North America, before expanding to Europe in April and Asia in May. At E3 in June, it was made public that the game was now targeting a release in the 3rd quarter of 2017. Not long after this, the official PlayStation magazine declared the launch date as November 16th. This would prove to be incorrect, as it was officially confirmed at the end of July that the game was actually scheduled for October 17th. And after a limited time demo was made available earlier that month, GT Sport would debut as planned on the 17th of October. So the recap for this one is pretty straightforward. The initial launch was marked for November 15th, 2016. This was pushed back to 2017, later clarified as October 17th, 2017, when the game would go on sale. So just a single delay spanning 11 months in total. But did this delay make any real difference to GT Sport? Well, that's hard to say. In terms of content, the game was pretty bare bones when it first came out. It's hard to imagine it being that much worse off if it did come out in 2016, and given that the game was constantly updated with new content, I don't think it would have made a massive difference in the long run. The main impact, I believe, would have been the overall polish of the game. One thing that you can't say about GT Sport is that it was unpolished. It looked great, felt good to drive, and even sounded decent too. Comparing it to the PS3 games, it was far more consistent in its quality. New features like scapes and the livery editor worked well, and the online racing in sport mode was solid also, no doubt helped by the learnings from the beta test. Overall, I think the delay was a good decision, but as I say, I'm not that fussed. Given that this game was all about constant updates, it wouldn't have been surprising to see it launch in a slightly less finished state in 2016, gradually develop into how it actually was at launch in 2017, and then expand beyond that into how it eventually ended up. GT Sport may have been a departure from the norm for Gran Turismo as a franchise, but when it came to the delays, it was actually quite a return to form. Gran Turismo 7 was unveiled in June 2020 at the PlayStation 5 Games event, but its origins actually date back quite a long time. Of course, after GT6, many expected GT7 to be the next game in the series. In September 2013, 3 whole months before GT6 even launched, Kazunori was quoted by Famitsu as saying that GT7 on PS4 was only a year or two away. In fact, GT7 would continue to be referenced by him through to 2015. Of course, in the end, GT Sport would be the next title in the series. This isn't to say that GT7 was actually in development before Sport. The reality is that he was most likely talking about Sport, but calling it GT7 to not give Sport away, or it's possible that the name just hadn't been decided yet. Still, it's funny to think about. The first word on GT7 as we know it was in August 2017. Albeit in this case, it was Kaz stating that there were no plans for GT7 and they were fully committed to Sport. He even doubled down by stating, "For me, Gran Turismo Sport is Gran Turismo 7. But by 2019, there were some interesting rumours. It was suggested by an anonymous developer that Sony's next-generation console, that was to debut in 2020, would have Gran Turismo 7 as a launch title. And when GT7 was officially announced in June 2020, this seemed to be the case. In terms of how it was marketed alongside the PS5 and the wording used, whilst not outright confirming it, they did seem to imply that the game was due very soon. But as the PS5's launch in November inched ever closer, there were no more details given on GT7. However, in November, GT7 would be seen in a new PS5 video seeming to confirm the game for a planned release in the first half of 2021. Interestingly, this was later edited out of the original video, before the game again appeared in another PS5 advert in December. The wording used here was the more vague "coming 2021", but in February 2021 there was finally a clear statement. PlayStation president Jim Ryan declared in an interview that GT7 has been impacted by COVID-related production challenges and therefore will shift from 2021 to 2022. After that, it was almost complete silence through to September. This is when we would receive the second GT7 trailer. As well as the usual slew of new cars, tracks, and features announced, including that the game was now going to be on the PS4 as well as the PS5, we also received a solid date. March 4th, 2022. Considering that this was literally called the release date trailer, I suppose it didn't disappoint. After this, the marketing of the game, which had been mostly dormant for the past 15 months, suddenly kicked into gear, and GT7 launched, as promised, on the 4th of March 2022. Unless you pre-ordered your game from Amazon, in which case there was a chance that you received your copy as early as February 25th. Something similar also happened with GT6, but only from retailers in the Middle East. So let's summarise. Whilst it was somewhat implied to be a PS5 launch title, this was never said explicitly. However, the wording anticipated first half 2021 is pretty clear, even if it wasn't 100% confirmation. In this case, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt and use the end of June 2021 as our reference date. From there, the game was postponed to some point in 2022, which was then confirmed to be March 4th, 2022, when the game eventually released. So just one delay with a total delay period of about 8 months. I've made my feelings about GT7 pretty clear on this channel, so I won't go over it again. But just know that I don't think very highly of it. But did the delay prevent it from being worse? I guess so. I imagine it gave them time to model a few more cars and a few more tracks, but that's about it. I'm pretty certain that they didn't need that long to come up with the menu books or the roulette tickets, so much like GT6, the issues with the game seem to be far more by design rather than Polyphony simply lacking the time or resources to make the game better. If it did come out in 2021, I don't think my opinion on it would be massively different. Hey, at least this time round they had a pretty good reason for delaying it, so that's something at least. Well, there we are. That was every single delay of a mainline Gran Turismo game covered in this video. With that said, let's take a look at all of the key stats. Across the 8 different games, which ones were delayed the most and which were delayed the least? Well, as we discussed, the only 2 that got away completely were Gran Turismo and Gran Turismo 6. In terms of the games with the most individual delays, there was Gran Turismo 2, Gran Turismo 4, and Gran Turismo 5, each with 3 separate delays. If we now look at total delay period, this is where things get interesting. The game with the shortest delay period, other than the 2 that weren't delayed, was Gran Turismo 2. Being pushed back by just 2 months and 11 days. In terms of the game with the largest delay period, it's a surprise winner, or loser I guess, Gran Turismo 4, with a total of about 1 year of delays. Unless you want to start counting GT5 from that initial 2008 estimate, in which case that easily dominates with about 2+ years. Next, let's look at individual delays. The shortest individual delay also goes to Gran Turismo 2. Its final delay spanned just 4 days, from December 7th to December 11th, 1999. The only caveat to this is that the 7th was intended to be a North American release, whereas the 11th was the final Japanese release. But like I said, I judged it based on the dates where the game was first releasing, regardless of the region. If we were to keep the region consistent, it would still win, as it released in North America on the 16th, so a delay of just 9 days. In terms of the longest individual delay, well, it's another surprise. Gran Turismo Sport wins that one. Yep, it was only delayed once, but its date moved from November 15th, 2016 to October 17th, 2017. Meaning a pushback of 11 months, the single longest delay in Gran Turismo history. Alright then, now let's add it all up. In terms of the total number of delays across each of these games, the final figure comes to 13 individual delays. And bear in mind, that factors in 6 of the 8 games. But now, here's the big one. The total delay period across the entire franchise. So, if we add together every single delay I mentioned in this video, all 13 of them, we get a total delay period of 4 years, 1 month, and 11 days. Once again, feel free to add another year to that if you want to consider GT5's 2008 estimate as official, but even without it, it is an absurd figure. It averages out to just over 6 months worth of delays per game. And if we only consider the 6 games that were actually delayed, this rises to an average of about 8 months. The most recent delay came to an end in March 2022 when GT7 was released, but until then, the series had been going for roughly 24 years and 2 months. This means that at that point in time, this franchise had been in a period of delay for roughly 17% of its entire history. You know, when I started making this video, I had some idea about what was coming. But after digging through the archives to find all of this information and piece everything together, it really has been eye-opening. Because yes, there have been games that were delayed for longer, a lot longer in some cases, but none have done it with as much regularity as Gran Turismo. It does make you wonder why they even bothered announcing release dates at all. Of course, the influence from Sony is most likely why, but I also believe that without the support from Sony, Polyphony would never be able to get away with this. Remember, Gran Turismo is still the best-selling PlayStation exclusive series ever, and this reputation seems to have granted Polyphony an extra level of freedom that other developers don't seem to get. Because throughout the 2000s, Gran Turismo was proof of the mantra that a delayed game is eventually good. Although, with the more recent advent of updates, there are no guarantees that a rushed game will be forever bad. Even if the quality of these games can no longer be assured, no matter how long they spend making them, I have no doubts about the future of this series in one particular aspect. So here's to Gran Turismo, the numerous delays that we've had to endure, and the many more in the years to come.